recording. Tanya, can you do that?
Yes.
Thank you. So we are planning to record. So if you prefer not to be on screen, please just simply turn off your video. Also keep your microphone on mute during the presentation part of this discussion. And you can put your setting on speaker view so that you see just the speaker until we open it up for questions and comments. These events are designed as conversations with some opening remarks by our speaker and then a moderated dialogue. So please feel free to communicate with each other using the chat function. And you can go right ahead and start chatting about who you are and why you're here tonight. So this is the second session in our Spring Chat Fest series of online conversations with sustainability activists. Our sessions are scheduled every other Tuesday through the end of April. And our next session is April 9th at 6 o'clock Eastern Time, entitled Sparking Community Arts for Social Change, with our guest Asaya Kurtz. Asaya is the director at Camden Fireworks. She's also a Max alumna and recipient of the Rory Turner Prize for Best Capstone in Cultural Sustainability. So that should be, she's doing amazing work in Camden with fireworks. And then on April 23rd, we'll be offering an information session on why cultural sustainability with some special guests. So if you want to learn more about the courses we offer, about the faculty who work with our students, or about the kinds of careers our students achieve, you might want to join us then. And so let me say that our recordings, we do record all of these sessions, as I mentioned. They are available on our YouTube channel. This is an image of it called Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. You can go there and listen to past recordings. Taylor Ruchkowski, who is one of our admissions directors, will put that link in the chat for you. And then I've asked her to also put the link in for the page that describes all of the spring webinars that are happening from across all of our programs this semester. So you can take a look at that and go ahead and sign up so that you can get it on your calendar for any of them that you want. And then finally, I've asked Tanya to put the link to the cultural sustainability page in case you want to explore a little bit more about our program. So tonight we explore the complex concept of indigeneity and the challenging work of decolonization. Whether you work in a museum, in the arts, as an activist, in education, or in healthcare, there is a long overdue need to reverse years of assumptions, work patterns, and perceptions framed through a colonial lens. But what does that decolonization effort look like? How do we work together to understand the complex experiences of indigeneity in order to ensure effective change? We are joined tonight by award-winning researcher and curator Cynthia Vidaurri for a conversation about her work in Mexico, Cuba, and the US Southwest, which has illuminated cultural expressions and ensured appropriate cultural representation of multiple indigenous communities. Cynthia Vidaurri is a folklorist in the research department of the National Museum of the American Indian. She has published book chapters and articles on a variety of cultural expressions and curated several museum exhibitions, Smithsonian Folklife Festival programs, and digital exhibitions. She has also developed and led training programs for universities, museums, and community organizations. Her exhibition El Rio, co-curated with Olivia Cadaval, who's also here tonight, won the Smithsonian Education Innovation Award and the Americo Paredes Prize of the American Folklore Society. So Cynthia will share some of her insights, and then we plan to open it up for a conversation. So if you want to ask a question or post a question to make sure we get to it later, you can put that in the chat, and Tanya and I will be looking out for those. So without further ado, let me stop sharing, and please welcome Cynthia Vidaurri.
Thank you, Amy. Let me see if I can manage the technology here and do a screen sharing. Did that come up?
Yes.
Okay.
So those of you who are, you might want to put side by side and speaker as your view, if you want to see both Cynthia and her PowerPoint.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this. I'm trying to get this lined up in a way that I can see both both the screen and what you're looking at on there. I don't think that you're, excuse me. Yeah, I don't think that you're seeing the, are you seeing the title page?
No, you went one past it, I think.
Yeah, I'm trying to move this.
Keep going back.
Okay.
There you are. Now you're on the title page.
I'm sorry, this is what happens when you have too many monitors on your computer. You don't know what you're looking at. Amy, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in these conversations. I think these topics of indigeneity and decolonization are probably kind of underlying principles that all of us who work with Native communities and in Native communities are having to address, regardless of our academic disciplines and regardless of the types of work products that we're trying to come up with. Today, I came to the realization as I was developing this presentation that there are so many ways to come into this topic and try to understand it. I certainly don't have any solutions. I have some experiences to share, and I'm hoping that this really generates a conversation with everybody to think about how we can move these ideas further along. But tonight, I want us to think a little bit about the concepts of colonization and decolonizations and indigeneity. I want to look at it from a very specific angle and looking at the Spanish colonial approach and experience at the macro and micro levels. And I think kind of this case study approach helps put kind of a fine point to some of these topics that we're talking about. And also, I want to leave you with some closing thoughts and certainly a lot of questions to proceed. One of the things that we have to realize when we're talking about these topics is that they are not monoliths. We tend to think of them as these great ideas, and we're going to pursue decolonization, and we understand who is and who isn't indigenous. But in reality, it's quite complicated, and we need to think about at what moment in time we're looking at. We need to think about in what part of the world we're taking on these topics, whose experience, who are the primary actors, what are the motivations for colonization, how did those, quote, colonized respond, how does this impact the concept of indigeneity, and who controls who is and isn't indigenous. And we really need to think about these ideas as we're trying to come up with some solutions. I found this wonderful quote from the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queens College, and I thought it was really, really well done. And I started getting into the nuts and bolts of it and then had to step back a little bit. So I'll share with you. Decolonization could be understood as taking away the colonial, but this raises the question of what colonial means. Colonization involves one group taking control of the lands, resources, languages, cultures, and relationships of another group. So all of that sounds good up to now. And then they say, in Canada and the US, where human habitation on these lands began with indigenous peoples and continued with European migrants who arrived with the intent to claim the lands as their own, colonial usually means Eurocentric. So this is the part of this quote that kind of set me back and going like, okay, where does that leave Latin America in this discussion? And for those of us who are from the Southwest who have worked in the US-Mexico borderlands or in other places in Latin America, we certainly see kind of the folly to this approach I don't know if this was written very much from a vantage point of being Canadian, and they see the relationship with their indigenous peoples with indigenous peoples that are now in what is now the United States as kind of a continuum, but don't necessarily see the connection with Latin America. But that certainly did kind of gave me pause for concern. So this is kind of what my counterpoint to this would be. And this map, I think, is really highlighting the extent of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. The fact that you see so much blue covering this territory, forget about what is now Latin America, but look at what is now the United States, extending all the way to Florida and going up into to the United States, past Canada and on into Alaska. These lands were once occupied by Spanish people and indigenous people that were impacted by the Spanish project on there. This was a very different experience than what the British colony system was and the experience that Native peoples had as a response to the British occupation. These were technically viceroyalties. They were not colonies. While the end result might have been very similar to what happened in the British experience, technically there's a legal difference, and there's a lot of scholarship going on in Mexico right now, really countering that argument of colonization in Mexico in particular. So I think we also have to look at the motivations for colonization, which are very different, again, to the British experience here. Spain was at a unique moment in its history when it takes on these ventures. And the battle cry and the motivation for colonization was gold, glory, and God. Not necessarily in that order, and not necessarily by all of the players involved, but it seems to provide a good overview as to why Spain was interested in colonizing the Americas. This lovely woman here on the left-hand side that you see, that is Isabella la Católica. She's given the sobriquet, the Isabel the Catholic, because she was so fervently a Roman Catholic. She and her husband, King Ferdinand, managed to, in the course of a relatively short period of time, to take back all of the different kingdoms in Spain and unified them, and also expelled the Muslims from predominantly southern Spain. She was so fervent in her religion that she then declared that from then on, her reign was going to be dedicated to the glory of God and to the furtherance of the Roman Catholic faith on there. This was a very, very significant approach in the way that Spanish colonies were set up there. Gold becomes really, really important because you need to rebuild the economy in Spain after taking on all of these wars for this extended period of time. Glory becomes really important because Spain at the time, like most European countries, functioned under the law of primogeniture. Primogeniture requires that all of the family's wealth and resources go to the eldest son. If you were the second and third and fourth son, you were left to your own devices, which meant in Spain, you could either go into the priesthood, or you could go on and go into the military. So for a lot of these men, going into the Americas became a way for them to stake out kind of their own fortunes there. Women were definitely out of this picture, although there were some laws that protected women's rights that did not exist in the British experience. And of course, God is at the core of all of this. Queen Isabella had very, very specific orientations of the way that she felt that Native people should be treated. She did not feel that they should be enslaved. And even in her last will and testament, she says she leaves marching orders for basically all of her subjects, saying that these people are to be protected, they're to be considered citizens of Spain, and if anything is done unjustly to them, that should be reconciled. Well, we all know how well that went, but it was a nice thought, at least in its sentiment. And the image on the right, you see this kind of very ornate interpretation of the meeting of Moctezuma II, who was the emperor of the Aztec Empire at the time that Cortés arrives. And according to at least a Spanish interpretation, it was a pretty auspicious event. So if we look at what is now Mexico, which was the viceroyalty of New Spain, today we have an approximate 12 million individuals who are indigenous, but something like 26 million self-identify as having indigenous ancestry. These are slightly different figures because of the way that indigeneity is understood in Mexico. There are governmental terms by which the census are taken every year that classify communities as indigenous, and if you happen to live in that community, you're automatically considered indigenous. If you've gone off and moved to the large cities that are not considered to be indigenous communities, you get left out of the count. However, that 26 million, estimated 26 million figure is for people who are self-identifying as indigenous, independent of the physical community in which you live. The process of de-Indianizing was different than in the US. I don't use the term detribalizing because that's very problematic in Mexico and Latin America in general. The concept of tribes does not exist there in the same way it exists in the United States. Historically, the populations that were on the US-Mexico borderlands had indigenous populations that were once united communities. And now all of a sudden we have a political line that divides these communities in kind of very strange ways. We share a 2,000-mile border with the United States and Mexico, and we have ongoing immigration from Mexico to the United States. There's been some wonderful research done from the 1940s during the Bracero program, where agricultural laborers were brought in, where they've actually been able to go back and identify that there were indeed indigenous people that came into that program. All of the fine points of that information are lost because of the way the United States kept its records. It just kept track of people according to nationality. So what happens in Mexico as a result of the arrival of Spain, it's quite unique compared to what it is in the United States. The battle at Tlatelolco, or the Plaza of Three Cultures, that takes place on August 13, which was heroically defended by Cuauhtemoc, who was the last emperor of the Aztec Empire, fell into the power of Hernán Cortés. It was neither the triumph nor defeat. It was the painful birth of the mestizo people that is Mexico today. And this battle symbolically ends the fight between the Aztec Empire and in Spain. It's often couched in terms of Aztecs, although there were many, many, many other communities that were involved in these battles. But it's a very symbolic place. And this Plaza of the Three Cultures is named so because you have archaeological remains of pre-colonial structures. You have colonial church in the background, and in the very far background, you have a contemporary glass and metal building that symbolizes contemporary Mexico. So during this colonial period, you have what's called the castas system. And it was basically the concept of racial and cultural blending on a very superficial level. This became the dominant way of understanding social categories during the colonial period. And here you see an 18th century painting that was basically a how-to manual, a visual how-to manual that described these different categories. And this particular image is always the first image in the series of paintings. And it always shows a man and a woman and a child that is the offspring of this couple. And there's always a label that explains who these people are. In this particular case, it says de Español y de India, mestizo. From Spanish and Indian, you get mestizo. Depending on which series of paintings you look at, it can be anywhere from 16, some say 25 different categories. And the further down you go in the social structures, the more pejorative the terms become. There is no way to know how accurate these categories were. This was way before the days of genetic testing. And the church usually kept the records of who you were. And all of the birth records were the territory and domain of the church. Sometimes if you were in good with your church, your parish priest, you could be moved up a few notches in your category, which meant a difference in experiences and opportunities for you. If you were not in good standing, you kind of took what you got. But this term mestizo becomes very kind of ingrained into Mexican, not currently Mexican, but also in the Viceroyalty of New Spain. It is a very complicated term. It has different meanings at different moments in its history. And today it's very contested by a lot of scholars coming out of Mexico looking at this concept of mestizaje. So I'm going to take you through several hundred years of Mexican history to get up to date so that you can understand a little bit of the deep dives that we need to take as we're thinking about this idea. So the Viceroyalty of New Spain is unhappy with its status and wants independence from Spain. So in their need to create a separate and independent nation, you have Father Miguel Hidalgo in this painting here, who is, calling to arms all of Mexicans to stand up against Spain. And this concept of building nation, haciendo patria, becomes a very important concept that is woven through time in Mexican history. It is, you saw it during the independence movement. You saw it at a moment at the fight against Mexico's fight against the intervention by the French later in history, and again against the United States during the the Mexican-American War. And the battle cry called all to become Mexican. And even at this moment in time of independence movements, just taking on the term Latin America was rebellious. It was, creating its own geographic identity that included Europeans, included indigenous people, included African people that were in the Americas. And so it flattens individual identities. It seeks to look at kind of a collective, a sense of self or collective history and a collective sense of culture. Again, moving ahead a few hundred years here, the 1848 US-Mexican War. You can see in this dark line here on this map, the original territories that were Mexico and then what was ceded to the United States. So from Texas to California and going up into Nevada and Utah, you can see the amount of land that was ceded to the United States that already had several hundred years of experience of colonization and indigeneity under Spanish rule. And if you look at the color densities on this map, these are people who are of Mexican origin and by population. So it's still a highly concentrated area, which has an implication on what happens in the future. So once again, we're going to move quickly into the 1960s and 70s during the Chicano movement, which is part of the larger civil rights movement in the United States. I was really attracted to this particular image because in the middle of the frame, you see the sign that says Indians of all tribes. Again, using the word the tribes, which is problematic, but I think it really kind of visually gives you a sense that this was a moment in time where people were looking at their sense of identity in very different ways that had been done in the past. I refer to this as kind of perhaps the first moment of decolonization carried out by Chicanos. Again, the term Chicano is problematic because since its use in the 60s to today, it has changed definitions depending on where you are in the United States. Also, the way Mexico understands U.S. Chicanos is very different than what it's understood in the United States. It's very, very specific to geography, and it's specific to generation and a particular moment in time. But it was the first time that we could publicly say that we were indigenous. It was, again, part of this larger civil rights movement where people asserted themselves in ways that had previously not happened. There was a tremendous effort to recover pan-indigenous cultural practices. And I say pan-indigenous because these folks were de-Indianized for hundreds of years, and many lost track of the specific communities from which their families came. So at this particular moment in time, the movement glums onto a concept that's referred to as Aztlan, which in the Aztec cosmology, Aztlan is a place of origin from which the Aztec peoples moved, what is believed in now the United States, moved to the central part of Mexico. And they were to follow this legend and end up settling in central Mexico. So there was an attempt to go back and recover so-called Aztec traditions This is seen very pejoratively by some populations. They refer to these folks as neo-Aztecs and pretend Indians. And so again, very complicated process. This is a moment that launches the development of Chicano studies programs in universities, and it gives birth to genres such as Chicano art, Chicano literature, Chicano politics, all of which are now taught in many universities, predominantly in the U.S. Southwest. Today, you see continued actions towards recovery of indigeneity. You see here a picture of an ofrenda for Day of the Dead, which is now practiced by everybody on the planet, not just in Mexico, not in the U.S. Southwest exclusively. You see people going back and recovering family histories, doing genealogical research. You see a lot of people on social media showing people how to go back and research their indigenous identity. Of course, the advent of DNA has brought that on in all sorts of very significant ways. You see people either accepting and or adopting alternative forms of knowledge, spirituality, foodways, rites of passage, and an effort to decolonize their cultural practices. And in this process, symbols are extremely important, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down. You cannot talk about indigeneity in contemporary society without talking about the impact of the internet. COVID gives rise to a unique moment in history where Mexican indigenous populations that had recently immigrated to the United States are not able to travel freely to Mexico because of the limited mobility that was brought on by COVID. But internet then becomes a way to create trans-border communities. Past COVID, it's also a place where you can create a digital or collective memory about traditions and rituals and spirituality. It's also a place where a lot of contentious discussion happens about indigeneity. There's a lot of rhetoric out there about what decolonization means. It's a place where it can be theoretically quite democratic, where everybody has a space to opine on the same, but it can also be extremely contentious, and it can be very disrespectful to some communities, but it's extremely important. So some closing thoughts for you. And I know that I've brought you through a lot of moments in Mexican history. We've talked about a lot of topics, but I'm hoping this kind of gives you a sense of the monumentality of this topic and the complexities of this topic. So as a folklorist, I look at people's cultural practices, and I want to know where the indigeneity is in your daily life. Independent if you have a tribal identity card, if you can prove your genealogy, if your genetics indicate that you're this, independent of that, how do you live your life? And in talking to several folklorist colleagues, we've had conversations about what this actually means there. And when I spoke earlier and talked about how important symbols were, these are probably the two most significant images for Mexicans and Mexican Americans. The first one being the Mexican flag, which is, just by the way, has been recently identified as the most beautiful flag in the world. I don't know who actually made that determination, but a lot of people voted on it, and this is the flag that became identified as the most beautiful flag, of which Mexicans are quite proud of that designation. And you see in the middle field, there is, again, that this symbol that is so important and seen all over Mexico. It goes back to the Aztec cosmology that says that they are to travel from Aztlan all the way until they find this symbol that says this is where you're to settle. And the symbol was an eagle perched on a cactus with a serpent in its mouth. There's a lot of debate whether the actual story included the serpent or not serpent. The serpent has now been accepted as part of the mythology, and it's found on the flag. And this, you can see the eagle on the cactus, but the cactus is situated on the Aztec glyph for an island and sitting in the water. The other image here on the right is again the Virgin of Guadalupe. That's an apparition of the Virgin Mary that becomes extremely important. In 1531, she appears on multiple occasions. to a native man named Juan Diego, who's since been canonized in the Roman Catholic Church. And this image shows a woman that is of dark complexion and with all of this symbolism that is associated and understood within the cosmology of native peoples throughout Mexico. I am not Roman Catholic, but I am very much a Guadalupana. I grew up with this image, and I really didn't understand why she was so important to me. And then years later, after the fact, after I've done a lot of deep dive into Mexican history and culture, I come to understand the significance on there, and she is very much a part of my daily life. Olivia Cadaval, my colleague at Folklife, and I can tell you lots of stories about the Virgin of Guadalupe and her presence at the Smithsonian Folklife Center. She is very much an important image in Mexican-American Chicano history and culture. I guess the closing thoughts that I can leave you with is decolonization is a process, and it doesn't happen overnight. We didn't get here overnight, and it's not going to go away overnight. We need to understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all process. This process happens in a much larger context, which is political, economic, historical, and cultural. We have to understand that we have absorbed and normalized many colonial ideas as individuals and societies, and we don't necessarily see them as colonial. We have a difficult time distinguishing them on there. It sometimes is disruptive in our sense of who we are and in our other cultural practices. Theories are frameworks, but they are not action. Sometimes, you know, as folklorists in particular, we get very, very absorbed in these great theories that are coming out, and I think they're very much important and part of the process. But they, at the end of the day, are not action. The action is really happening, and the most significant action is happening in the communities themselves. And you also see within universities and advocacy centers, you see this work. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it takes, you know, all of these actors to come in to really provide action to make any changes. And I think in thinking about decolonization, we have to understand that there's different ways of being indigenous that, again, are very specific to location and communities. We also have to think of indigeneity as a process. This can be a personal and collective journey for the person going through that, but also the people on the outside observing what indigeneity is. We have to understand who has the power to say who is and who isn't indigenous. In the United States, the people that have the authority to say who isn't indigenous base that authority on, and in many situations, on treaties, which in and of itself was a result of a colonizing process on them. We have to understand that we deny indigeneity of others, and if so, why? And then ultimately, what do micro acts of decolonization do, and how do they lead to sustainability and indigeneity? I know that's a whole lot to go through, and I'm hoping that this spurs some ideas, some questions, some counter thoughts, and I want to turn it back over to you now. So let me see if I can stop sharing.
Great. So we'll stop share and switch to gallery view so we can see everybody who's here. That was a lot.
As is decolonization.
Yes, yes. I mean, I love the idea of kind of using a case study. That's not one that many of us are familiar with, right? In order to demonstrate the complexity of both the concept of indigeneity, but also the concept of colonization and decolonization. So, and I love this your final question and the idea of micro decolonizing actions yeah. So, do you have some examples of that or some instances where you've seen that happen?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's several instances, and I think part of them you see in in the media sphere during COVID, for example. A lot of individual jingle dress dancers came out and did healing dances, because it is a healing ritual to begin with, and in kind of in their own front porch, if you will, which is, it's a dance which is usually done by several women. You don't do this in isolation, but they were sent out as prayers for not only other indigenous people, but for the world on there. And I thought, like, here's this one person sending a prayer, sending a healing dance to the entire world based on who they are and what they do and how they know and how they understand concepts of well-being and such. Very small, in the grand scheme of things. It's not something that's going to win a Nobel Prize, for peace or for science. But I think it's really significant that it allows the rest of the world, like the audience that you can get on internet, to do that. I see examples at small community museums, and people now trying to question the way we do museology, and who has the right to say what about whom, and what alternative narratives can be saved. That's a slightly larger scale. Students taking classes about them. I have to confess, and I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I've become a TikTok addict, because a lot of this discourse is happening in TikTok, and I can consume a 3-minute video and see what the world is saying on there. But I love seeing these video clips of young people getting their DNA test back, who are Mexican American, or identify as Mexican American or Chicano or Hispanic, Latino, whatever term they're calling us these days. But they'll read the results and they say, "Oh, I'm 60% Native." And it comes as such a surprise to them, because they don't know their own history. They don't understand their own cultural practices. We do what we do at home just because that's what we always do, but we don't really understand it as being indigenous or not. So the fact that they're kind of going out there and trying to find out who they are is kind of a first step to recovering indigeneity. I think is a pretty cool thing that's happening on there. And so what happens when you have all these micro examples of things happening? How does that end up becoming a larger aggregate that leads to larger movements? I was really thrilled to have found these images about this Chicano moratorium that I showed, that had the tribes of all types. Washington, as you all know, is kind of the center where all of these national protests takes place. And when there was all of this backlash about our immigration processes, there were protest march in Washington, and there was a contemporary sign that says Aztecs, Mayans, and I'm sorry, I forget what the other term was. Is like, we are not immigrants; we are in our homeland. And so you stop and think about that whole process of individual discovery and recovery, turning into kind of larger social action, on there. So I'm really excited about seeing that sort of stuff, because I mean, that's what folklorists like to engage in.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that especially if they're putting their reactions on TikTok, if they're putting their reaction on TikTok, it's a great way to say, well, are they excited that they have indigenous blood, or are they upset that they have indigenous blood, right? I mean, that would be an interesting study to see. I don't know. Are you finding, I mean, is it mostly pride about that?
I think some of them are, responses of pride. Most of them are responses of surprise. Like, you don't know that. And again, that's part of the colonizing project, is to strip away those kind of particularities, to where the point is that you can't defend yourself based on your own culture, your own heritage, your own legacy. So there's a lot of surprise, but I find that it's quite interesting on there, because my parents' generation would probably not have reacted in the same way. It was like, because of the discrimination being so intense, you would not have necessarily gone out and announced it in such a way.
Yeah, and it seems like that has changed historically. I was reading this article that I actually want to put the name of in the chat for everybody. about the concept of indigeneity actually being a settler concept anyway, sort of imposed onto, you know, a community as those colonists came in. Well, what do we call these people? How do we identify these people? And you know, and it seems like it's gone through all kinds of different understandings or interpretations from, you know, the very sort of pejorative, simple, idyllic, backward, you know, to Red Power, right, which was the movement in the 70s that really launched so much indigenous activism, I think, around the world. So, yeah. Anybody have a question they want to ask or an idea or concept they want to toss in there?
Well, people are thinking, I want to respond to that. You talk about the challenge right now in the United States of tribal recognition, that this is something that you can't do unless you can prove that you had a relationship with a colonizer, that you have to show all of this evidence. Like, you can't just say we are because we've always been here in some form. But you have to do it. You know, that's why people very much defend, you know, these treaties, because that was one sure way, because the United States government had recognized you as a sovereign nation on there. So here it is, we're giving the authority to the government to say who is and who isn't, independent of what your life ways are like, independent of what your family history might be like. And we take that and we normalize it and say, well, this is the path, this is the way we go and do this. I actually had a Navajo friend of mine and colleague who, she and I would have these long conversations about this. She goes, well, why don't you Ghana people just go for tribal recognition? And so, well, we actually do have a treaty in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that actually protects the rights of Mexican and indigenous Mexican rights on there. Of course, that treaty was violated, like so many were on there, but it's not necessarily seen as one of those conventional treaties that protects indigenous rights in the same way that the treaties that we see during the British colonial period.
Yeah, Barry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi there. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, Cynthia. Thank you so much for the great presentation. And, you know, just with somebody with very little knowledge of the real context in Mexico, the complexity is really striking. I was there for a brief visit last summer and was struck by that as well. But the way you know, sort of added to that is really, really thoughtful and helpful. And I just wonder, you know, something you didn't touch on as much, I'm sure you've thought a lot about, is as somebody identifies as a folklorist, and I don't know much about the work you do, whether it's ethnographic or more kind of collaborative community work. You know, how does the label of indigenous or indigeneity, you know, sort of enable your work, or does it get in the way, or, you know, sort of how does that play out? And by the way, this is also with my students who are meeting after this session on the GAPS course on critical perspectives in ethnography. Will be listening in, I'm sure, but love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Barry. That's a really great question. I find, again, talk about normalizing concepts and you don't even think about it until you're out there. You know, I'm American, and when I work in Latin America, I carry that baggage with me. And I get schooled a whole lot by communities. I just had a conversation with somebody that we're working with in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. And we were talking about, you know, Day of the Dead terminology. And he says, oh, but we don't call it this, we call it this, which was yet another particularity that was specific to their community. Which, you know, as a scholar, I was trying to put some sort of nice fancy bow on it all and make it very easy to consume. And I'm going like, okay, that goes out the window on there. He also shared with me that in their particular community, independent of what your official government census information indicates, independent of your individual self-identification, in their community, you are not considered part of that community unless you have property that you go back to, because you have to be connected to the land. So if you leave and your family all migrates to the United States, you technically aren't part of them any longer because you're not going to understand the world in the same way. And I think in the topic areas that you're approaching at, and as much as we say, like in folklore, we're not talking about macro views of culture, which, I love to do the ethnographic work because it gets more particularized and there's less opportunity for errors, but we carry that baggage in there and it is so specific to us, an individual community that it's very difficult to use those theoretical frameworks that we come out of school with. It's very difficult to do that because you go into community and they totally blow them out of the water, and you have to realize. And my mentor always said, like, know the theory, but don't be guided by that because you're always going to be proved the fool in the community you're doing the research in. And I think it's always proved to be right in my experience on there. And I think it's really important to be self-reflective. Because we've internalized much more than we think we have. What kind of device can we use to help with that self-reflection? I don't know. I'm not the answer. Whatever awareness I have now comes out of decades of doing this, but I can't say that I walked out, knowing this, look back at your own work and the things that I actually gave conference papers on field research. I look back and I'm going, oh my God, what would make you think that you had any knowledge of what you're talking about? Because it was simplified, and I think the academy kind of pushes us to be reductive in many ways, and be definitive, and it does not allow us for all of those nuances that we find when we're really doing ethnographic work. I'll give you one real clear example that really kind of chaps my is the whole concept of machismo as it was applied into Mexico, that has condemned Mexican men forever and Latin American men in general on there. But there's an anthropologist who went in and worked in the poorest communities in Mexico and saw a lot of male behavior that was not necessarily because they were Mexican, but it was male behavior of people that were marginalized, of frustration and turning around and trying to exert dominance over somebody, over something in their life. And the behavior was not good. Well, that's human behavior, that men have behaved that way all over the world and throughout time. It cannot be ascribed to any one population. The behavior is much broader than that. But here's an example of how we've done a tremendous injustice to an entire population of men because we don't understand that. You go into Mexico and really get into communities and start talking to people about what does it mean to be macho? And the responses are to be responsible for your family, to be respectful, to be courteous to women, to defend your children, to defend your community. And they're complete polar opposites to how we in the academy have used that term.
Right. Fascinating. Well, thank you. I mean, I love that insight that even, armed with the best theory that all knowledge is local, ultimately, and the dynamics are always going to be shaped by that. That's very helpful.
I have no answers, just a lot of questions.
That's great.
Yeah, Candela.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Cynthia, for that presentation. It was seriously super interesting and informative. And I think this might be a detail that was not so central to your presentation, but that I was kind of interested on or caught up because I hadn't heard about it before. What you said about Mexican academics or Mexican communities fighting against or like trying to differentiate what colonies and viceroyalties were in terms of how they affected indigenous communities. This is something I hadn't heard before, and I would really like to know a bit more about it, if that were possible. Thank you.
Yes, Candela, that's really a great question. And I have to confess, it's something new for me. And as I've been trying to catch up on and read it, and actually I learned about it in TikTok. See, there's some great things that you can learn as you're whittling away the hours on social media. But the scholars that are coming out of Mexico, they're talking about there are technical differences between the viceroyalties and colonies, particularly with the British experience, because again, in the conversation that we just had, we tend to paint the concept of colonies and colonizations with this very wide brush, and there are so many particularities. The difference in, and this is a wonderful phrase that comes out of New Spain, obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey, but I do not comply. The distance was so great, and it took so long to get word back to the crown of things that were happening on the ground in Mexico and in other places, in South America, that by the time they got a response, the local authorities had already addressed it in a certain way that was more appropriate to that particular, like a boots on the ground kind of experience and the immediacy that it required. So they would respond back to the crown, says, I obey, but I do not comply. We already took care of it. We took care of it with our own kind of local solution. And so this is a relatively new branch of scholarship that's coming out, where they're talking about we cannot understand Mexico in the same way that we understand the United States in colonial experience, because they were technically different and the ways in which they enacted were quite different on there.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, it's something that sounds quite new, but I do understand what you mean, and I'll be looking up these differences. It's super interesting as well to be able to understand the different experiences better and in a more nuanced way. So thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And I think that's kind of adds to my point here, is when we're looking at decolonizing, and if you go back to that map, you cannot take the approaches that seem to be working on the East Coast and perhaps on the northern borders in the same way that you would look at the rest of the United States, because the influence was for several hundred years in what is now the U.S. Southwest and beyond what we normally consider as kind of the Mexican borderlands, because those influences were there. And the way we understand that, the whole discussion about mission Indians in California, for example, this was a device that Mexico used to try to control territory, and they used the ranch, the fort, and the mission as these institutions to try to control this outward territory, because they were afraid of incursion by the United States, and because it was so sparsely populated, they were trying to come up with institutions to lay claim to these territories. Well, the native peoples that were exposed to these three institutions responded very differently than what happened on the East Coast. On the East Coast, the church was never that prevalent a player in the whole process, in the experience of native peoples that became exposed to the religious institutions.
Any other questions or comments anybody would like to share? Yeah, Rory. You're muted.
I'm sorry. Hi. I do so with some trepidation because I had to leave partway through of your wonderful talk. I had an urgent call that I had to get on. But there's a couple thoughts that I'd love to just share with you, and maybe that would be of some interest, I hope. One is and this is drawing from the work of Seth Holmes, the anthropologist who did work on Mixtec, I think it was Mixtec, indigenous people who migrated to the Northwest for berry picking, and has a very kind of elegant and convincing portrait of the kind of racialized and ethnicized hierarchies within those farms, and also talks about the idea of the ways that those folks had internalized some kinds of ideas about the indigenous people that were part of those hierarchies themselves. So it's this structural violence that then becomes naturalized, and I wonder, there's sort of indigeneity is a term that I think I associate with a sense of kind of emancipatory justice, but it's also a term, or or it's pointing to these symbolic categorizations that are coming. And I loved what you said about Native American people having to kind of have, had uh, 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 to have gotten written down, in order to be legitimate. But so that's one thought, is the complexities of that term in terms of its positive and negative valences. Um, the other thing that and you may have commented on this, that I've found really intriguing, is things like Marisol de la Cadena, the anthropologist who worked in Peru, and really suggested that this idea of like an alternative cosmos, a different way of being in the world at such a depth that the mountains themselves as being spiritual agents that people are part of, and the kinds of frictions between that way of seeing things and then the ways of seeing things of land holding and legal rights and political regulation and all of that. And I feel like if we're really going to think about culture as a kind of generated from the life of people in lived realities, that we can't just apply the lens of our own way of thinking, which even includes, I think, a really substantial critique of the whole idea of culture. You probably come across all this and know more about it than I do, but I always think that's very interesting, and it helps me to think about things hopefully in a more expansive way. So those are sort of two topics. I guess you could call it perspectivalism and naturalization of oppression.
Yeah. Rory, those are just really, really interesting comments, and I've grappled with a lot of that myself. And indigeneity is a term that's come into the parlance, and we use it. And again, that's part of our kind of our academic training and our kind of orientation, doing things. But when you actually talk to people, they're going like, "What do you mean indigeneity?" Right? Because you're asking for people to explain who they are in your terms, not in their terms.
Mhm.
And, what does that mean? So then you have to explain to them, like, okay, this is what I mean by using the term indigeneity. And then they're looking at you like you've got a unicorn coming out of the front of your head going like, why, on there. And I think it's really interesting. If you look at people's names for themselves, not the names that were given to folks and their identities were modified, but the names of the people, certainly, I'm not familiar with Canada. I have never worked in Canada, but certainly the names that people are giving themselves in what is now the US and throughout Latin America, there are variations on we're the people. We're people differentiating themselves from animals. And so that's the only differentiation that they make is we're people. And senses of communities were pretty kind of late in the game on there in terms of the human experience. So when we come up with terms like indigenous, I mean, it might be useful in this particular moment in time that we're trying to grapple with this. I always feel like these terms need to have a series of footnotes that go with them, on this date at this time when the wind was blowing in this direction and the rain was coming down, from, this direction, because next week it could be completely different. So I think for those of us who do ethnographic work and we're in communities and we're talking about these things, it has to be, we have to come up with a different language for actually getting to these conversations. I was actually contracted to do some work in anticipation of the Elko Cowboy Poetry Gathering thing, and they said, we want you to do this. So I go out there and I'm asking people, and some of these cowboys who, first of all, who don't have the slightest idea of what I do for a living and don't understand why anybody pays me for doing this work. So I'm sitting there, you know, with these guys telling them like, you know, tell me your cowboy stories and tell me your cowboy poetry. And they're looking at me like, and I was getting nowhere with this, you know, whatsoever. And oral traditions are not my specialty. This just, you know, but I do ranching culture. So I'm grappling with this. One day, I'm sitting at the table. This guy picks up the phone and he says, no, I'm just sitting here. And he's talking in Spanish because I'm sitting here with this lady and she wants me to tell her lies. Quiere que le eche mentiras. She wants me to tell her some lies. And then it dawned on me that amongst themselves, the term they taught, you know, that they use for these oral traditions is literally echando mentiras, telling lies. From then on out, I use that term, and all of a sudden, like the floodgates were opened. I could have spent the rest of that summer struggling with trying to get people to tell me stories and not really being very successful. It was just serendipitous that conversation led me to what the local term was that was shared amongst that community. And it opened up those doors. So I think for those of us who do this work, we have to be very cognizant of the limitations of the parlance. You know, we have to be very cognizant that we have to fine tune it at every occasion that we have a conversation. We have to fine tune it. We have to work it. And hopefully, if we're really lucky, it comes back with a much more sophisticated term that we can use for future generations, you know, doing that research, and that we built it kind of into our larger repertoire. Your other comment about this work that was being done in South America and stuff, and in the sense of the natural environment and stuff. And Amy and I've had some limited conversations about what this thing means, you know, on kind of our sense of indigeneity. And we oftentimes, and certainly our mass communications has fed us this very romanticized sense of being indigenous and being one with the world and being on this stuff. Native people, in my opinion, perhaps historically had such a close connection because these were land-based cultures. These were environmental-based cultures. Well, in the 21st century, Native peoples live all over the place. And I'm always struck about that image of the construction of the high rises in New York City and seeing these men perched on these steel beams. And you're going like, well, how does your sense of environment and the way you win the world and with the world change when all of a sudden you're in a different ecosystem, if you will? This is not to say that there aren't communities that are deeply entrenched in their worldviews, that are deeply entrenched in spirituality that is connected to the environment. But there's also Native peoples that are Roman Catholic, that are Presbyterian, that are Methodist, that are Episcopalian, and perhaps have a blending of these traditions, perhaps have adopted the very European sense of what these religious orientations are. So it's very hard to kind of hone in on what that relationship is for any one of these communities. Again, it's so specific to the community, and it's specific amongst, you know, individuals on there. You were talking about this experience of the Mixtec communities coming into the United States and working on them. There's some fascinating things that are happening. In a lot of these communities coming out of Oaxaca, and particularly, there are pilgrimages back for feast days. Well, then in and of itself is this hybrid, because there are feast days that are dedicated to saints, but it's an indigenous tradition of what this feast day is. It's not, Mexican Catholicism makes Rome crazy 6 ways from Sunday, because it's a whole different game. So these people will routinely go back to celebrate the feast days in their community. And a colleague of mine was telling me that there's now a new dance in one of these communities where the locals are dressing up in what they perceive to be how their community members in California are doing. So they're men dressed as women with blonde wigs, with big giant sunglasses, with padded backsides and padded front sides, to say, just because you've gone off to the United States, and just because the norm is to have all of the surgery, the norm is to go blonde and have blue contacts, don't forget who you are and where you come from. And it's a cautionary dance. It's like, you know, don't think that you cease to be from us, and be careful what you adopt, because that not really might be something that is suitable for you and who you are. Which I find really fascinating, for the community come and wrap people on, you know, the knuckles and say, no, you've gone too far.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Great example of, it's like who speaks for who, and where is the the creation of a meaningful world coming from? Is it coming from these outside rhetorics, or it's like, yeah, people in these communities are not stupid. They know about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if
So,
this is how we, if this is cool or not. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
yeah. So any other questions or comments? Yeah, Olivia.
Yes, that's wonderful, Cynthia. Brings back a lot of good moments. Thanks. But also, are we not constructing indigeneity, the academia constructing indigeneity and sort of trying to fit it to something that we're exploring. And I don't know how much we're able to do this in dialogue with the people that we are working with. I don't know. I don't know. Each experience is different. What do you think, Cynthia? In your thoughts of a different trajectory, we were very naive when we started working together. We did great things. We did not understand a lot of things, which was very, very healthy. And now, as we're trying to, make sense and share and really look deeply into, I think indigeneity is one of these areas that concerns me.
No, you're absolutely right. And, I think we go in there with this sense of, first of all, we go in with the sense that we're doing good. None of us get into this work to not do good. I think we go in very naively into this. I have to acknowledge you with this audience that's present, that Olivia's been a longtime friend and mentor and teacher and colleague, and I've learned volumes from her. But I think probably one of the most valuable lessons that I've learned from you is that you always allowed yourself to be guided by responses of these communities in which you were working. For the '94 Festival and Cultural Development, when people said they didn't want their tent where it was located, and you said, of course not, let's fix this. Like, what do you need? And as much field research as you do in preparation for, for doing this, you have to stop and think, these communities place a tremendous amount of trust in us to represent who they are and to help create an environment for them to speak for themselves. And we sometimes don't get it right, but to be cognizant of the fact that we don't always get it right, and to be flexible enough to make the correction on this is so essential to this process. And I think, over the course of time, that helps you become better at what you do. Every time you learn a lesson like this, it might be slightly painful at the moment, and it might cause a few headaches trying to rectify it. But I think in the long run, it helps us to be more aware of the ways that we go into community and ask questions. And I think here is kind of where the rub is. This is really where the rubber hits the road, is one understanding that we don't go in with the best understanding of the territory which we're entering, but how agile and how adept are we at learning on the spot, responding and making corrections, and then perhaps coming back to the academy or coming back to our respective workplaces and enacting better practices. At the end of the day, this is a collaboration of some sort. We can't do it without them. They can't do this without us. So where do we create a space where everybody benefits? And you're talking about early on, I used to think, oh, we want equal relationships. Well, there's no such thing as equal. There's always going to be a power differential in some form or fashion. What is equitable? To me, that's the more significant question. What is equitable in these relationships as we work with communities on there? What is, how does everybody walk away getting something that is useful to them and is productive for them? That's not a very easy balance to come up to, and it's always a constant mediation. And I think when we understand, and I think that's kind of where the problems are in museums, is like, if we understand the limitations of what we do, that allows us to be slightly better than what we were previously. I was working with a museum, I won't mention the name, but they were going through a process of decolonizing. And I was getting all of this stuff, and I was responding to them and going like, they decided to get rid of their entire collection because it was done at this very colonial moment. And then I'm just going like, okay, well, that's really noble of you, but what does this get you? You know, and I mean, obviously human remains are critical, funerary objects are critical, but just by getting rid of your collection, does that really bring any change? Or can you use that moment in collecting as a teaching moment and talk about the shortcomings of that? Can you bring the Native communities in your area to come and respond to them? Or can they take those objects and interpret them in slightly different ways? You know, fundamentally, you're a museum. Are you telling me that you're wanting to not be a museum any longer because you no longer have collections? And all of this was spurred because somebody on their board went to a conference and they heard the term decolonizing. They came back armed with this new weapon, saying like, we're going to decolonize, and not thinking about decolonization as process, they're thinking about a finite action that all of a sudden we're deemed not colonial any longer.
Well, and also doing that, I mean, and then making that decision without actually consulting those tribes or communities in the first place to find out if in fact they want them back. Do they have the capacity to house, archive, display, represent those things as well, right? So I mean, I think you all have beautifully articulated the complexities of this. And, you know, one of Manveer Singh's quotes is, many groups who identify as indigenous don't claim to be First Peoples. Many who did come first don't claim to be indigenous. And, you know, and I think that just, you know, gets at it's not about who's first or who's connected to the land or, but it's about, as you said, how people identify. It's about worldview and you know, how you are in the world. And in terms of decolonization, listening, right? Listening to the people who are impacted by the work that you do and making sure that you're doing it in a way that is not harmful. And we have a question in the chat from Changa that says, can any of you give an example of repair after harm that you've been involved in? Does anybody have an example for Changa that would be helpful?
I don't have a personal example. We can certainly talk about the issue of things like NAPRA and repatriating human remains. There's this sense like, oh, you just return everything back to the communities and such. It's much more complicated than just that. Like in principle, yes, it's returning things, but you have to go back and look at the provenance of these human remains, and is the information actually correct? Do we know the community from which they came? And assuming that you can identify the community, and assuming that the community wants that, you know, that you've identified the community, then you have to stop and talk about the community's spiritual practices and stuff. Not all communities want to deal with the departed. It's a, you know, just like once you're gone, you don't talk about. I have a Navajo friend who refuses to come into my house anywhere around Day of the Dead because she doesn't want any of that imagery around her. So it's much more complicated than say, yes, we're just going to give these inappropriate things that we have in our collection back to communities. There's just so many nuances and so many steps. In principle, concepts like of NAPRA are a good repair. But it's not immediate, it's not overnight, and it does take a lot of work to get to that stage to do that. We've had conversations within our own museum because we have, our collection is probably about 30% or so from Latin America. And the concepts of these things are very different than what they are. The sensibilities, I should say, are very different than what they are in the United States. Many communities in Latin America say, we don't have the wherewithal to maintain this or to house this. We do want it to go to a museum. We don't want it to come to our community. We do want it in a museum. We do want scholars to research it. We do want them, to which those of us with North American sensibilities respond like, oh, we can't do that. But again, how this process of decolonization is going to be so specific on there that we can't assume that it'll all fit everywhere we might go. But I can't give you an example of myself of an act of reparation. I think for many of us who do the work we do, it's more front loaded. It's like how we go into the community to begin with, and being very thoughtful and careful about clarifying what our intent is, what it is that we want to do, what it is that we would like to understand from them. And if you front load all of that, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a better outcome, but hopefully the conversations are much more transparent.
Yeah. Good question though, Changa. I mean, it's complicated, right? It's there aren't easy answers. I think there aren't easy answers. The good news is that we are moving forward, that that decolonization efforts are happening, that and beyond that, I think understanding multiple voices, there's so many great, advocacy organizations and organizations that are really out there intended to create agency and opportunity for Indigenous communities, and to try to not reverse, but at least to begin to address the invisibility, the erasure, those kinds of violence that has happened to Indigenous communities. Yeah.
I've got a little thing. I want to try to speak briefly on this, but I had an experience in my time in Nigeria. This was when I was doing doctoral research, where one of my main research assistants and friends' cousin was a native doctor, Dibia, there, and a man who was a taxi driver had been having all sorts of trouble in his life, and divination was cast, and it was determined that this was because of the unease of a spirit of a member of his broader kin group who had been sold into slavery to pay off a debt. And actually a lot of people that were taken into the transatlantic slave trade were through this kind of a mechanism, and so they did a ritual for this, and I was really privileged to be part of it. And that, I think, then, I mean, that had a huge impact on me, and it made me realize the kind of the depth of the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade to people in those regions, which were, became war zones essentially in the 18th and 19th century. And so I've been this isn't reparation in a big sense, but it led me to a kind of political position of advocacy for reparations. And in my teaching, I've tried to suggest that, but also in my work in Maryland, it's been about kind of trying to help be a partner in sort of in dismantling the notions around Africa and racialized hierarchies that have so much a part of American society. But I would say, like, maybe even more broadly, I mean, I think in some ways this is what cultural sustainability perhaps is all about, is to be working to support some kind of self-definition of identity and of community, and without sort of imposing an outside framework, listening and valuing other ways of knowing, valuing other ways of expressing, and focusing on ways that are meaningful to people that are participants in those communities, rather than in a kind of, either an academic or an actual plunder, So anyway, that's a thought,
Yeah.
Chaga. I hope that helps.
Well, that's a great segue to close out our conversation. Cynthia, I want to thank you so much for a really provocative conversation. Posing questions for us to really grapple with and think about. And as we've said, there aren't any real answers, but there's an intent and an awareness that is a really important first step. So I want to just point out Tanya Rechkowski, who is is in our admissions office. If anybody is interested in knowing more about our graduate programs, these are the kinds of conversations we have in our classrooms and in our courses. Many of you are in our courses, so I see some students here. So there's Tanya's email address, and I can also share this screen just so that you can see. Taylor is our specifically graduate admissions counselor, and her email address is there, and then my email address is there too, if anybody's interested in just wanting to chat about this program at all. But again, Cynthia, thank you so much. This was really wonderful. I so appreciate you taking the time to be so thoughtful about these issues and putting together a presentation that really got us thinking. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Amy.
Okay. All right. And maybe we'll see some of you in 2 weeks with our conversation on sparking community arts for social change. So thanks.